All right, friends and neighbors, we're going to start into chapter 22 now. Chapter 22 talks about cities and how population affects those and how we can make cities more sustainable. And so we're going to talk about section 1 here. So in section 1, we have this idea, this term, urbanization. So we need to know what urbanization is, and it's this basic idea that we're growing or creating urban areas, places where lots of people congregate together. It's a measure of the percentage of people living in this particular area. And so that's urbanization, and then we have urban growth. And so that's actually where we're measuring the rate of how fast these urban areas are growing, how fast, what rate at which that's happening. And it happens for two reasons. There's a natural increase because of more births in the area and less deaths in the area, and then people are moving in from rural areas to this urban area, and that's creating urban growth as well. And so urban growth can result from one of two reasons. People can either be pulled into urban areas, and so there's a lot of advantages to living in urban areas. There's more access to jobs, food, housing, education, better health care and entertainment for people. And so for people who want to live in bigger cities for those reasons. Some of you guys probably want to move to a bigger city when you graduate from high school or college because of those reasons. And then there's the push. People are being pushed into urban areas from rural areas as well for a different set of reasons. Poverty can drive people into urban areas. A lack of land for growing food. You just don't have access. Declining agricultural jobs in search of something else. War pushes people into those areas, and so does famine. And so these are some things that cause urbanization or a growth in urban areas. There are four major trends at work when we look at this. So the population globally of people that are moving into urban areas is increasing. So about 30% of people lived in urban areas way back in 1950. And if we look at the projections for 2030, we see it's 60%. So that's a huge increase. That's a double the percentage from 1950 to 2030. So it's a growing thing, and so we need to keep that in mind so we understand the impacts of that and how we're going to handle that as time goes by. So they're expanding rapidly. So two urban areas with a population of 10 billion is what existed, or 10 million existed in 1970. And the prediction by 2025 is that we'll have 37 of those areas. So we're going to go from 2 to 37. That's a huge increase in huge populations for people. How are we going to manage it? So, by the way, urban growth, just so you know, is much, much slower in developed countries than it is in developing countries. So in developing countries, we see that the urban growth is going crazy. And poverty is becoming more and more urbanized as well. There's huge ghettos that are forming, huge shanty towns in these developing countries. Estimates right now, 1 billion people are living in these slums, these extreme poverty situations in urban areas. And so let's look at some of that breakdown. So we have two different categories. We have things called megacities. And megacities are just anything with 10 million people, just that. And so you can look at some of these ideas, 2004 estimates versus the 2015 projections. So the greater New York area, for instance, had 16.8 million people in it. They predict that to be 17.9. So you see it's a slight increase there, not a huge increase. Mexico City, growing a little bit. Los Angeles, growing a little bit faster. Sao Paulo, Brazil, a little bit faster. Buenos Aires, a little bit too. But look at this in Africa. Double the size. That's just insane, right? And so these are some of those big, huge mega cities as well as hyper cities, over 20 million people across the world. And so it's quite clear you can see where the urban area is if you just look at pictures of Earth at night. So 4 phases happen or have happened in the from 1800 to 2008 in the United States, these changing trends in how the population was laid out in the U.S. So a lot of people lived in rural areas back in 1850. Only 5% lived in big cities or central cities, and now that's pushing towards 80%. So The first migration was from rural areas to larger central cities. And then from that, like moving into New York, from that there was a migration that moved out into the suburbs and a push to go back the other way. And so it caused what we call suburban sprawl. So half of all the urban Americans live in suburbs, which are still part of urban communities. And so that has its own effect, and we'll see that later. And then we've also in the United States, so we moved into big cities, and then we moved out into the suburbs with those big cities. And then we also moved across the country. Most of the population in the United States was in the north and in the east, New York area. Over time, we've moved more southerly and westernly, and we've filled in places like Phoenix and Las Vegas and Houston, and all those big communities down in the south didn't exist 100 years ago, 200 years ago, in the way they are now. 80% of all the population growth has occurred in that southwest region when it comes to the United States. And then the last one, there's been a migration from cities and suburbs now to developed rural areas, planned developed rural areas. This is the last change in how we're managing this growth, and this is happening in the United States. So, breakdown of the United States. 8 out of 10 Americans live in urban areas. That's the vast majority of us. And about 48% of Americans live in a consolidated metropolitan area. So the greater Denver area, for instance, would be an example, right? But nonetheless, so quite large. What is urban sprawl? This is a term that matters a little bit, okay? Urban sprawl. So exactly what you think when you think of sprawl. It's a spreading out effect. So it's a growth of a low density development on the edges of cities. So we're not talking about really high skyscrapers and that kind of stuff. We're talking about shopping malls and big tract home sections and things like that. This creates problems, this urban sprawl, because it reduces the amount of agricultural land and wild lands that are around cities. It eats them all up. And why is that happening in the United States? Because there's ample land in general to spread out on. The government kind of promotes that growth and stimulates that growth through more and more land use and tax breaks and things like that. We don't have very high cost of gasoline, so traveling 30 minutes from a rural area into a big city to work isn't that super cost prohibitive. We have tax laws that encourage people to buy homes and own homes, and people want that on some space, and so that happens. We have state and local zoning laws that create a situation that helps for sprawl. And then we have a lot of changes in the way we handle things from a political point of view that can account for these things. And so part of that is poor urban planning, which we'll talk about later as well. How can we plan in the future to help out with this situation? And so we talk about suburban sprawl. We create what we call these mega metropolises, megapolises. So BOWASH, which you might not have ever heard of before, is named from the word Boston and Washington, because really from the greater Boston area through Washington, D.C., this is basically one huge urban jungle that's just connected together. It's not really separated at all. There's the major cities that are in there, but for the most part, it's just one big chunk of one huge town. And so that's a prime example of this sprawl. And you can see these maps down here showing some of these big major urban sprawls. You can see all the way through here. There's great ones, and then you have the Denver area, the Phoenix area, some big ones in California, Washington, Oregon. And then you can see how that's happening around the world as well. So why is suburban sprawl a problem? Well, it causes some natural capital degradation. So these are the things that it hurts from an environmental point of view. We lose cropland, we lose forest and agriculture, we lose wetlands, we fragment wildlife. These are all bad things that suburban sprawl do. We increase use of large surface area and groundwater, so we use tons of water. We increase the amount of runoff and flooding. We increase the amount of surface water and groundwater pollution. And then, of course, we have all the sewage problems just with water. With energy and climate, so we increase the energy use and waste, we increase pollution, we increase greenhouse gases, and we cause global warming issues. With economics, the decline in the downtown business areas creates a lot of its own problem because people move out into the suburbs. We have increased unemployment in the center of the city, which creates crime and all kinds of major things there. And then we lose the tax base to keep the center of the city functioning properly. These are all things that are problems that are created from suburban sprawl. So that's the start of this process. We'll move on to the next section coming up here.